When he met the new maid, the millionaire was paralyzed when he saw her bracelet, the same one his daughter was wearing when she disappeared many years ago. James Hartford was a man who seemingly had it all, or at least so it appeared. As the owner of one of Manhattan's largest real estate empires, he was surrounded by luxury. His days were filled with meetings in sleek offices, extravagant dinners at exclusive restaurants, and parties where the city's most influential figures vied for his attention. But beneath this polished exterior lay a broken man. 15 years earlier, James had lost something no amount of wealth could ever replace. His daughter, Emily, a sweet child with an infectious smile, she vanished without a trace during a walk in Central Park with her nanny. From that day on, James's life was irrevocably changed. His marriage crumbled. His ex-wife, and unable to bear the pain, left him. He threw himself into his work, building his company into a vast empire. But inside, the emptiness grew with each passing year. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. In the sprawling Hartford mansion, grand and echoing with memories, one item stood as a poignant reminder of Emily. A framed photograph on the mantel and a sketch of the gold bracelet she had worn on the day she disappeared. The bracelet, adorned with a small heart-shaped pendant, had been a custom piece, gifted to her on her 6th birthday. It was one of a kind. Years passed, but James never stopped searching for answers. He hired private investigators and offered rewards, but all he got were dead ends and emotional scams. The world moved on, but he remained anchored to the day his daughter disappeared. The pain of losing Emily never truly subsided, but James learned to conceal it behind a carefully crafted mask. Yet on quiet nights, when the mansion felt emptier than ever, he allowed himself to revisit the past. That day in Central Park replayed in his mind, unraveling into a nightmare he could never escape. Emily had been 7 years old, her face glowing with excitement. The nanny, a young woman named Linda, had seemed trustworthy and attentive. James hadn't questioned her reliability. That day, Emily had begged Linda to take her to the park so she could play with her new scooter. James, preoccupied with work commitments, reluctantly agreed, a decision he would relive countless times, cursing himself for not going with her. Later, the police recounted the events with clinical detachment. Emily and Linda were seen entering the park together, but only Linda emerged, with no sign of the little girl. Linda claimed Emily had run off and gotten lost in the crowd. Her explanations were inconsistent, and James, consumed by desperation, suspected Linda knew more than she admitted. However, the investigation yielded no concrete evidence against her. Linda left the city weeks later, disappearing without a trace and leaving James with more questions than answers. For years, James replayed that day in his mind. He imagined Emily frightened and lost, wandering among the trees and strangers. He thought about the bracelet with the heart pendant, something that was supposed to keep her safe, but now symbolized her absence. He often wondered if she was still alive, if he would ever see her again. The uncertainty was a wound that never healed. Looking ahead, James decided he needed help maintaining the mansion. Despite his regular staff, he wanted someone to take care of the finer details of the house, especially now that he was beginning to feel the weight of his years. That was when Olivia Carter appeared. She was young, barely in her 20s, with wavy brown hair framing a delicate face and eyes that carried something indescribable. During her interview, Olivia seemed out of place in the opulent mansion. She wore simple clothes and spoke timidly, but her words carried a genuine sincerity. She explained that she was willing to take on any job to help cover the costs of her evening nursing classes. James couldn't explain it, but something about her gave him pause. There was an air of familiarity he couldn't put into words. When Olivia reached out to take the papers he handed her, he noticed a thin, gold bracelet on her wrist. A strange sensation gripped his heart, but he brushed it off, attributing it to exhaustion. She was hired that very day. At first, Olivia seemed captivated by the mansion, but she didn't ask many questions. She carried out her tasks efficiently, though James noticed she would sometimes pause in front of the fireplace, gazing at the photograph of Emily with an interest he assumed was natural. However, he began to notice details he couldn't ignore. The way Olivia moved through the house, as though she instinctively knew its layout. Small gestures that reminded him of Emily, like the way she touched her chin when she was deep in thought. Something was stirring within James, but he forced himself to silence those thoughts. On her third day at work, Olivia was tidying up the guest room when James walked in to check on her progress. It wasn't like him to oversee such tasks, but something compelled him to watch Olivia, as if he were trying to unravel a mystery. That was when he saw it. As she bent over to adjust the pillows, the bracelet on Olivia's wrist caught the sunlight streaming through the window. It reflected a familiar gleam, a golden shine that made James's heart race. He froze in the doorway, unable to take his eyes off it. When Olivia turned and noticed his expression, she asked, confused, "Is everything all right, Mr. Hartford?" James tried to mask the storm of emotions within him. Slowly, he approached, his eyes fixed on the bracelet. "That bracelet? Where did you get it?" His voice was deeper, almost hoarse, as though the answer might change everything. Olivia, taken aback, glanced down at her wrist. "Oh, this? I've always had it as long as I can remember. It was one of the few things with me when I was taken into the foster system." "Why?" James felt his legs weaken, gripping the back of a chair for support. He struggled to process what he had just heard. The bracelet was identical to the one Emily had been wearing the day she disappeared. The same heart-shaped pendant, the same subtle engraving on the side. "Forever my princess. It's unique," he murmured, his mind flooded with memories. He knew he couldn't ask any more questions at that moment without raising suspicion. But one thing was clear: that bracelet couldn't be a coincidence. James spent the rest of the day in an unshakable state of unease. The image of the bracelet on Olivia's wrist lingered in his mind, like a flame he couldn't extinguish. That evening, he sat in his office, staring at Emily's photograph above the fireplace. His daughter's smile in the picture seemed to hold a mystery, as if she were trying to tell him something he needed to understand. He couldn't ignore the coincidences. He decided to investigate discreetly. James knew that directly confronting Olivia would be reckless. She likely wouldn't comprehend the depth of his suspicions. Still, he needed answers. The next morning, he called an old friend, David Grayson, a retired private investigator who had worked on Emily's case years ago. David was one of the few people James trusted implicitly. Without revealing too many details, James asked David to find out everything he could about Olivia, where she had grown up, who had placed her in the foster system, and any clues that might connect her to Emily's past. In the meantime, James began observing Olivia more closely. He noticed her subtle habits, like the way she ran her fingers through her hair or hummed softly while working. It was almost unbearable. Each detail sent his heart swinging between hope and fear. Late in the afternoon, he found Olivia again, this time in the kitchen, preparing a salad. "You're very organized," he remarked, trying to sound casual as he struck up a conversation. Olivia smiled shyly, but something in her gaze seemed distant, as if she carried an invisible burden. "It's something I learned early on. Growing up in foster homes teaches you that," she said. Her words hit James like a punch, and he had to mask his reaction. He knew he needed patience, but his anxiety was starting to erode his ability to maintain the facade. The wait for David Grayson's findings turned James's days into a silent torment. He found himself revisiting buried memories, trying to piece together fragments that didn't quite fit. His mind swung between the unbearable hope that Olivia might be Emily and the crushing fear that it was all just a cruel coincidence. That night, James was sitting in his office when the phone rang. It was David. The investigator's voice was steady but serious. "I found some preliminary information," he began, pausing just long enough to heighten James's tension. David explained that Olivia had been found in a shelter in Newark, New Jersey, about 3 months after Emily's disappearance. There were no precise records of who had left her there, only a note that read, "Take care of her." The sole tangible clue was the bracelet Olivia had been wearing, the same accessory that now tied James to the young woman in his home. "That's not enough to draw definitive conclusions, James," David continued. "But the timing and location, it's a hard coincidence to ignore." He suggested a DNA test as the next step, should James want to confirm his suspicions scientifically. After hanging up, James sat in silence for long minutes. He felt the weight of a hope he dared not fully embrace. The thought of going up to Olivia's room crossed his mind, but he knew it wasn't the right moment. He needed more evidence before reopening the wounds of the past, for her or for himself. The next day, James approached Olivia cautiously. As she was cleaning the library, he walked over, holding an old book. "Have you ever had a DNA test done?" he asked casually, trying to sound nonchalant. Olivia chuckled softly, unaware of the gravity of the question. "No, never." "Why?" James forced a smile. "I'm just curious about genetics. Sometimes it's interesting to learn where we come from." He let the conversation end there, but his mind was already racing with ways to obtain the material needed for the test. That night, James waited anxiously for Olivia to fall asleep. He needed to act discreetly, without arousing any suspicion. As he walked through the silent corridors of the mansion, his footsteps echoed like a reminder of the gravity of what he was about to do. His mind wrestled between guilt and the desperate need for answers. He entered Olivia's room cautiously, the dim hallway light casting a shadow on the soft carpet. Olivia was sound asleep, her breathing steady and rhythmic. James noticed the bracelet gleaming on her wrist, like a beacon guiding him toward the truth. On the vanity, he spotted a hairbrush she had left behind. With trembling hands, he picked it up and carefully extracted a few strands of hair caught in the bristles. Holding them between his fingers, he was overwhelmed by a wave of conflicting emotions. It was a simple act, yet laden with meaning. The next morning, James sent the material to David's trusted lab without providing many details about the case. The following 48 hours would be crucial, and the waiting left him even more introspective. He spent much of his time in the mansion's garden, gazing at the flowers Emily had loved as a child. The memory of her picking daisies and laughing by his side felt so vivid, he could almost hear her voice again. Meanwhile, Olivia began to notice a change in James's behavior. He was more reserved, more distant. During dinner, she tried to strike up a conversation, but he seemed lost in thought, responding only in monosyllables. "Is everything okay, Mr. Hartford?" Olivia asked, a slight note of concern in her voice. James hesitated before answering. "Yes, just thinking about some work-related things." It was an obvious lie, but Olivia didn't press further. 2 days later, James received a call from David early in the morning. He was sitting in his office, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hands while staring out the window. The phone rang, and James felt his heart race. This was the moment he both dreaded and longed for. "James, we have the DNA results," David began, his voice neutral but laden with subtext. James didn't respond immediately, gripping the phone tightly as if it could help him process what was about to come. The test confirmed it. Olivia is Emily. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. James carefully set the coffee cup on the desk, his hands trembling. He tried to respond, but his voice failed him. "Are you absolutely certain?" he managed to ask, even though he knew David wouldn't deliver this news without being confident. "Yes, the genetic markers leave no doubt. But, James, I think it's important to proceed carefully. This discovery will change everything, and you need to think about how to tell her." James hung up without responding. He sat in silence, David's words echoing in his mind. Olivia was Emily. His missing daughter was alive and under the same roof. What should have been a moment of pure joy was instead an avalanche of emotions. Relief, guilt, and fear. How could he reveal the truth without shattering the world Olivia knew? As he walked down to the foyer, he saw Olivia in the living room, arranging some books on a shelf. She looked carefree, completely unaware of the storm of revelations happening around her. James felt a tightness in his chest. For years, he had imagined the moment he would find her again, but never like this. He realized he had to proceed with extreme caution. That night, James sat once again in his office, trying to formulate a plan. He knew that telling her everything at once would be overwhelming. He decided he needed more information about what had happened after her disappearance before taking the next step. The following day, James resolved to delve deeper into the mystery. He needed to understand how Emily had become Olivia and, most importantly, what had happened during the years they had been apart. It was still impossible for him to fully embrace Olivia as his daughter without piecing together the entire puzzle. He contacted David again, asking him to deepen the investigation into the time Olivia had been left at the shelter. David readily agreed and promised to dig for more detailed information, including records of who might have left Emily there or any evidence connecting Linda, the nanny, to her disappearance. While he waited, James began paying closer attention to his casual conversations with Olivia. In one particular moment, she mentioned having strange dreams about a girl running in a park. It's funny. It always feels familiar, but I can't tell if it really happened or if it's just my imagination. Those words echoed in James's mind for the rest of the day. He desperately wanted to ask more but feared scaring her. He decided he needed to find a way to help her retrieve those memories without pressuring her directly. Later that afternoon, David called with new information. He had discovered that, at the time Olivia was found, there was a man who worked at the shelter and remembered key details. His name was Richard Bell, and he mentioned that a mysterious woman had dropped off the child, appearing nervous and constantly looking over her shoulder. Bell also recalled noticing the bracelet but didn't feel it was appropriate to question her, as the woman seemed in a hurry to leave. He might be able to give us more details, but we'll need to go there and speak with him in person, David explained. James agreed without hesitation, determined to travel to New Jersey the next day. That night, as he watched Olivia preparing tea in the kitchen, James felt a wave of hope mixed with apprehension. He knew the next step could finally bring the answers he sought, but he feared the impact the truth might have on both of them. The following morning, James set out for Newark with David to meet Richard Bell, the man who might hold more pieces to the puzzle. During the drive, James remained silent, staring out the window at the passing scenery. His mind was torn between the excitement of being closer to the truth and the fear of what he might uncover. They arrived at Richard's modest apartment, located in an old building in a humble part of the city. Richard, a man in his 60s, greeted them with mild curiosity. He had been contacted by David beforehand but didn't know the full details of why they were there. After some polite formalities, James got straight to the point. "Do you remember the girl who was left at the shelter about 15 years ago? The bracelet? The woman who brought her?" His voice faltered briefly, but he quickly regained composure. "I believe she's my daughter, who went missing around the same time." Richard nodded slowly, his face etched with surprise. "I do remember her. She was a quiet child but seemed confused, like she'd been taken from somewhere familiar. The woman who brought her, I don't know much about her. She looked frightened, constantly looking over her shoulder, as if she were running from something." James leaned forward, absorbing every word. "Did you notice anything else? Anything that could connect this woman to someone or someplace else?" "Well," Richard paused, trying to recall. "She mentioned something about needing to protect the girl, but didn't explain what she meant. And one detail I've never forgotten. There was a small card with the girl, but most of it was torn. Only one name was legible, Emily." A chill ran down James's spine. It was the name he had chosen for his daughter, and hearing it in this context brought a wave of both pain and relief. David stepped in, asking for details about the card and whether Richard still had any records from that time. I handed everything over to the shelter. It might still be archived there, but this was a long time ago. As they left the building, James felt closer to the truth, yet more aware of the layers of mystery surrounding Emily's disappearance. He knew he had to visit the shelter to find whatever remained of the records, but the fragment of information about her name was already a significant step forward. The visit to the shelter in Newark was filled with a mix of anxiety and hope. James and David arrived at the weathered building, its peeling walls and worn sign indicating it was still operating as a children's center. The interior was modest, with old furniture and walls adorned with children's drawings that attempted to soften the austere atmosphere. A staff member named Clara greeted them. She was a middle-aged woman, kind but visibly overworked. James explained that he was searching for old records related to a girl left at the shelter 15 years ago. Clara frowned but agreed to help. This might take a while. Many of our records from that time were moved to storage, but some might still be here. Let me see what I can find. As Clara rummaged through metal cabinets and boxes, James felt the weight of the environment pressing on him. He imagined his daughter here, a confused and frightened child surrounded by strangers. The thought tightened his chest with each passing moment as he took in the somber surroundings. After nearly an hour of searching, Clara returned with a yellowed envelope. I think this is what you're looking for. There isn't much, but it might help. James opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a simple file with the name, Emily, partially faded, the approximate date when the girl was left at the shelter, and a brief description. The only additional piece of information was an address listed at the time as the possible origin of the woman who had brought her. This address is in Trenton, David said, examining the paper. It could be a lead, but we need to be cautious. It's old information, and whoever was there might not be anymore. As they returned to the car, James looked at the file again. Even with the fragmented details, it represented a glimmer of hope. He decided he would follow the address no matter what they found there. The next day, James and David arrived at the address in Trenton. It was a simple house, its wooden exterior weathered by time, with windows covered by curtains that seemed to have never been opened. The yard was overgrown with weeds, abandoned as if no one had cared for the place in years. David knocked on the door while James stood a few steps behind, observing everything closely. An elderly woman answered, leaning on a cane. Her expression was curious but cautious. We're looking for information about someone who might have lived here around 15 years ago, David began, showing her the paper with the address. Do you remember anything? The woman, who introduced herself as Agnes, furrowed her brow in concentration. 15 years. That's a long time. But I think I know who you're talking about. There was a young woman who rented this place back then, maybe in her 20s. She kept to herself, didn't talk much to anyone. James stepped forward. Do you know her name? Anything about what happened to her? Agnes thought for a moment. If I'm not mistaken, her name was Linda. Yes, Linda. She disappeared suddenly, left everything behind. I always thought it was strange. She seemed like she was running from something. The neighbors used to say she was always nervous, always looking over her shoulder, as if she was being followed. A chill ran down James's spine at the mention of the name. Linda, the nanny who had disappeared the same day as Emily. He exchanged a meaningful look with David, who immediately grasped the significance of the connection. And what happened to her belongings? Did she leave anything behind? James asked, trying to keep the urgency out of his voice. Some of her things were left here, but a man came by a few days later and took them. He claimed to be a relative of hers, but I didn't trust him much, Agnes said with a shrug. Since then, no one's been back here. James thanked Agnes and returned to the car with David, his mind racing with possibilities. The connection between Linda and Emily's disappearance was clearer than ever, but the involvement of a third party, the man who collected Linda's belongings, added a new layer of mystery. That night, James returned home feeling the weight of the day's revelations. Linda, the woman he had trusted to care for Emily, was directly tied to his daughter's transformation into Olivia. But the presence of a mysterious man who had taken Linda's possessions introduced a fresh sense of unease. Who was he? And what role had he played in this story? As James processed the information, Olivia, oblivious to the storm of discoveries unfolding, sat in the music room trying to learn a new piano piece. James watched her from the doorway, hidden in the shadows. Each note seemed to resonate deep within his soul, bringing back memories of Emily's music lessons. He remembered how she used to swing her legs, too small to reach the floor, as she clumsily played. The resemblance to Olivia was almost unbearable. He decided he needed to speak with her. Not everything, not yet, but something had to be said. James entered the room, and Olivia stopped playing, smiling at him. "Is everything all right, Mr. Hartford?" James sat down in a nearby armchair, carefully choosing his words. "Have you ever wondered about your past? About who your biological parents might have been?" Olivia sighed, looking down at the piano keys. "I have, but I don't have many answers. All I know is what they told me at the shelter, that I was left there when I was very young. They always said I should focus on looking forward, not back." Her words hit James like a blow. He wanted to tell her she no longer had to look forward alone, that he was here to help her piece together the past. But caution held him back. He simply nodded, keeping his knowledge to himself. Later, as James reviewed the documents provided by David, an idea formed in his mind. If Linda had left Trenton so abruptly, there might still be records in the city that could shed light on her disappearance. He decided that his next step would be to visit Linda's old address to see if he could uncover more clues. The search was far from over. The next morning, James resolved to visit Linda's old address in Trenton. He knew the answers might be hidden there, and no matter how painful it might be, he needed to confront the past. He brought David along, aware that he might not be able to handle what he found on his own. The address led them to a row of townhouses in a neighborhood that seemed frozen in time. The paint on the walls was faded, the sidewalks cracked, and only a few cars passed along the quiet street. They knocked on the door listed in the records, but there was no response. James knocked again, harder. After a few minutes, a man emerged from the house next door, drying his hands on a dish towel. "Are you looking for someone?" the man asked, frowning. "Yes, we're trying to find information about a woman named Linda who lived here about 15 years ago," David replied, showing him the paper with the address. The man shook his head, as though sifting through long-buried memories. "Oh yeah, I remember her. She was kind of quiet but polite. Seemed like she was going through a tough time. One day she just up and vanished. No one ever heard from her again. Did she have any visitors? Anyone who helped her or might have been connected to her?" James asked, his voice heavy with tension. The man paused before answering. "Now that you mention it, there was a guy who used to come by every so often. He seemed rough, always arguing with her. I think he drove a gray van. Don't know his name, but I remember she seemed scared when he was around." James exchanged a significant look with David. The mention of the man reinforced the idea that Linda hadn't been acting alone. Someone else was involved, someone who might have forced or manipulated Linda into abandoning Emily. "Do you know if she left anything behind? Documents, belongings, anything at all?" James asked. "After she left, some things were left in the house. I think the landlord cleared the place out and tossed most of it. But I heard that one of the neighbors picked up a few boxes from the trash, thinking they might be useful. Maybe they're still around." They thanked the man and began searching the neighborhood, looking for anyone who might have kept Linda's discarded belongings. The possibility of finding something that could explain the nanny's actions filled James with a mix of hope and dread. James and David continued knocking on doors, asking questions and speaking with neighbors. After nearly an hour, An elderly woman named Eleanor confirmed that she had a few old boxes in her basement. "I always thought it was a waste to throw things like that away," she explained as she led them into her home. "I never went through them much, but some of the items seemed too personal to just discard." In the dark, stuffy basement, Eleanor pointed to a corner where 3 dust-covered boxes were stacked. James immediately knelt down and began carefully opening them. Inside, he found clothes, a few old notebooks, and mundane items that seemed irrelevant. But in the 3rd box, something caught his attention. A small black notebook with worn pages. He opened the notebook, flipping through it quickly until he found a page with a direct mention of Emily. On it, Linda had written, "I need to keep her safe. They can't find her." James felt a chill run through his body. "They who?" He looked at David, who was already sifting through other items in the box. The note reinforced the idea that Linda had been coerced or pursued, but it didn't explain why. Among the cryptic entries, there was also an address that James immediately recognized as his old home. This confirmed that Linda had maintained contact with Emily longer than he had assumed before disappearing. But what happened afterward remained a mystery. Meanwhile, David found a folded photograph at the bottom of another box. He carefully unfolded it and handed it to James. It was an image of Linda holding a small child, clearly Emily, in what looked like a park. But in the corner of the photo, partially visible, was a man standing near a gray van, his back to the camera. James gripped the photo tightly, feeling a mix of relief and indignation. The image proved that Emily had been alive and under Linda's care for some time, but it also suggested that the man in the photo had been involved. He knew this picture could be the key to identifying the figure who loomed like a shadow over the entire case. They thanked Eleanor and returned to the car with the boxes and the photo. James knew he was closer than ever to understanding what had happened, but the mystery of the man and the motive behind it all still lingered. Back at the mansion, James spent hours poring over the photo and the notes in Linda's journal. Each word seemed to carry unbearable weight, as if Emily's fate was hidden in the spaces between the lines. He sent the photo to David's lab for analysis, hoping to identify the man near the gray van. While waiting for the results, James decided it was time to confront Olivia more directly. He needed to open the door to the truth, even if it meant shaking her world to its core. After dinner, he asked Olivia to join him in the living room. The space was lit only by the glow of the fireplace, creating an intimate but heavy atmosphere. "Olivia," he began, his voice steady but laden with emotion. "There's something important I need to share with you. Something that could change everything." Olivia frowned, clearly confused. "What is it, Mr. Hartford?" He took a deep breath before continuing. 15 years ago, my daughter Emily disappeared. It was the hardest day of my life. Since then, I've been searching for her. And I believe you are that daughter." The shock on Olivia's face was immediate. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence that followed felt endless. This can't be true," she finally said, her voice trembling. "I don't remember any of this." James stood and walked to the fireplace, picking up the photo he had found. He handed it to Olivia, pointing to the little girl in Linda's arms. "This is you. This is Emily, my daughter." Olivia stared at the photo, her eyes filling with tears, as if trying to unlock buried memories. "This woman, she's in my dreams. And this place," her voice broke, and she covered her mouth with her hand, letting the tears fall freely. Before they could delve deeper into the conversation, David called with the results of the photo analysis. The man near the gray van had been identified as a known criminal involved in kidnappings and extortion. It was likely that Linda had been under threat when she left Emily at the shelter, trying to protect her from something far worse. James felt a surge of mixed emotions, rage at what Linda and Emily had endured, but gratitude for Linda's courage in saving his daughter. He vowed to use every resource at his disposal to bring the man to justice. But at that moment, his priority was Olivia. He turned back to her, his voice soft but resolute. "You're safe now. Whatever happened before, we'll face it together. You're not alone anymore." In the days that followed, James and Olivia began to rebuild their connection. He shared stories of Emily, memories from their early years together, while Olivia opened up about fragments of her life in the foster system. Each conversation seemed to bring more clarity, drawing them closer together. The journey culminated in a poignant moment when James held the gold bracelet with the heart-shaped charm, the very item that had connected them from the beginning. He handed it to Olivia, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This belongs to you. It always has. You are my daughter, and I'm here now. I'll never let you go again." Olivia accepted the bracelet with tears streaming down her face and embraced her father. For the first time, both felt the pain of the past beginning to lift, replaced by a renewed sense of hope and the promise of a future together. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and a comment. Let me know which city you're watching this video from. A big hug, and see you in the next story.